Live with Viewpoint this morning. Here, our guest this morning on Viewpoint with Mrs. Busby and the Old Geezer, a young man who has written about his memoirs as a kid on the farm in the more innocent days, kinder, gentler days, you might say. The last farm boy, friend and neighbor Paul Beaver, the author, kind of recounting some of the days when things were more simple. I was thinking, Paul, on the break, about the horse business and my association with riding behind the plow all day long, and kids don't believe, want to know how much I got paid.
Yeah.
I said, well, I'm sorry, we didn't get paid, period. That was it. That was the way it was done.
Just did it.
Many years later, I took a trip into the mountains with llamas as pack animals. I hiked back into the high country in Montana with llamas. And it occurred to me one day, walking down that trail, looking at those llamas, I was kind of like riding a plow all day, looking at the back end of the animal the whole day. It wasn't a very fun thing, except for the trip. Another thing I recall, Paul, is that the first time I got to take a box wagon of grain to the elevator at Burtonview, that was a big deal. Your granddad turned you loose. That was your responsibility. And like a young, dumb kid, when a horse goes back to home, if you control them, they want to go. They want to go back. And the same thing is in the mountains. If you take a horse up into the mountains, and you're smart enough, you'll just sit there and sit there and let the horse bring you back down, because he knows where he's going and how to get you there. Anyway, the horse decided to run. They're going home, and I let him run. And by the time we went down that long lane, they were pretty well lathered up with saddle soap and sweat. Grandpa Sisson was not a bit happy about that, and he let me know I got grounded for a good while.
Yeah, unlike tractors, you couldn't put gas in them and fire them back up.
You also talked about if you had pigs, you had a boar. If you had cows, in your case, you could get a really good bull right up the road in Elkhart. And
my great-grandfather did, I'm sure, got him from Gillette.
I was thinking about would be my great-grandfather. My dad talked all the time about his grandpa Knut Saul, who had a farm, and my dad spent a lot of time with him. And one day I said, you never talk about your grandpa Nesseth. I said, what was he like? And he said, I was pretty young when he died. He was gored by his bull. And I'm sure you can remember
that was
when everyone had one, that kind of thing happened around here, too.
That was more common. You think, I know when we've done some research in the old papers, every now and then you'd see somebody was killed in a runaway, struck by his horse. In other words, he was maybe taking a stallion out to breed a mare, and the stallions... You had to be real careful. They'd rear up and strike at you. And people were killed, but bulls killed a lot of people. And I know that's a story where I told about my dad that when we had a blizzard, I'm out there throwing hay out, and he said, look, if that bull doesn't quit looking at you, he's got something evil in mind. Don't turn your back.
I was always afraid to go down there. We had about a quarter-mile lane, and my grandmother sent me down to get the mail, and I was always afraid to go down there because the pasture went right up by the pasture, and Granddad had a great big old Jersey bull.
And they were nasty.
Just scared the daylights out of me all the time.
Did he come over and beller at you?
All the time. Fancy.
They were nasty. They were the meanest, I guess, of the bulls.
Well, I thought so because I was awfully young, and
you had good reason to be wary of them.
I made pretty good time going back and forth on that lane.
What was that sign on the fence? If you can cross this pasture, you need to do it in 45 seconds because the bull can do it in 30.
Oh, dear.
What prompted you to sit down? Is your grandson asking you questions about your life as a young man? Is that what prompted you to sit down?
Well, and to realize that so many of these things were going to be gone. The things that we know automatically or have an intuition about, like Judy, I'm talking about high school, how we felt about high school, what the mores were, that was all going to be gone because when you're gone, if it isn't written down, and people tend not to write down the common things. If they see some major event happen, they write that down, but they don't write about what everyday life was like, and particularly with us living on that farm, because I knew that whole world had ended. The coming into town and getting ice, because you had an ice box, not a refrigerator, and going to Marky Lyons late. And we used to go to Marky Lyons in the middle of summer, and it was dark. So how late would we have been there? 9:30, because Dad had been in the field all day.
Sure.
All of those things. The heating was minimal, and but my mother was a great cook, and we had the basic food all the time. I suppose now all the nutritionists would have a stroke. I mean, how could I possibly be this old and eat that food that we ate? Potatoes and gravy and all that, right? Well, you ate the same thing. Potatoes, gravy, all those basic foods, and we had them in the basement. And we milked
or cave.
In the caves, and and we had the well where you put the things down into the well. I mean, that was pretty primitive. That house was built in the late 1850s, that big old house. They had a summer kitchen in front of it, which is what people did. They built that little two-room brick, pretty crude building with a big steel pot in it to heat water, and that's where they lived when they built the big house. And my granddad was born in 1865, so he was gone before I knew him. But if you want to know what party we were affiliated with, his name was William Sherman Tecumseh, or whatever. William Tecumseh Sherman Beaver, whatever.
Tecumseh Sherman.
William, but he was named, and the year before his brother was born, and he was named Ulysses S. Grant Beaver, but he passed away. So Grandpa was named for the general, and there wasn't any doubt what side he was on. Well, I think they made their living out there and bought that ground by selling cattle to the Army. I guess basically the beef was going to the Army during the Civil War, because that's when Great Granddad made his money. And that and horses. They said he had, Tildy Keyes Titeman said they had, when she went through there, they had 30 or 40 horses running free in that pasture and never had a halter on them. He liked horses, but probably they were the group that he'd been selling, I'm pretty sure, selling them to the U.S. Army. And that's altogether different kind of a world. I thought that if I don't write that down, nobody will ever remember what it was.
Well, it's a good thing you've recounted that and put it down in print. Particularly your family, those who have come along, your grandchildren and great-grandchildren, so they're going to appreciate that. I think it was Thomas Wolfe said, "You can't go home again," and that's true. And nobody would want to go back to those times. Certainly, they were unique, pretty tough folks, and we had it pretty good. Think of the folks, the generation ahead of my grandparents, pretty tough going.
Oh.
And all those folks who were farm people, and of course that was the major thing around here at that time. And at that time, 80, 160 acres and get by on.
Young Granddad, I think he had a lot of that land, but it was all pasture land. The income, you saw in there the branding iron with his initials on it,
yes.
But the income in those days was primarily cattle and hogs. They raised a lot that, which were only semi-domesticated. They about killed grandpa.
That interested me. You said that they had timber, and of course you had to have that because that's where the pigs would live. Well, I never knew that.
Well, that's that old expression. Even
I thought
a blind hog
America.
finds an acorn, because that's what they would eat. They'd throw some corn out to them a little bit, but they were out. They'd breed and have their litters of 3 or 4, almost like they would if they were in the wilds of Europe. Have these pigs, and then actually my great uncle Michael lived across the creek in the other house where Ludwig's lived. He had Poland Chinas, and he was noted for raising purebreds, but that was a kind of, they were purebreds, but they were nothing like we have today. I mean, he had a good boar and hoped he'd survive out there in the wild with the rest of them, because then they'd round them up, and then sort of like cattle, and then they'd sort out those that they could sell and take them in.
Paul, it's interesting. Architecturally,
different world altogether.
The Beaver homes, they were kind of an interesting. They were all built architecturally alike.
I think they only bought one set of plans and passed it around.
Substantial. And right now you can go down 5th Street, and just across the bridge there you'll have Cal Beaver's place.
Cal's place, Dad's cousin.
by the way, he was an interesting individual. Really,
he built those machines.
remarkable. What a mechanic he was.
He also could play in the band pretty well too. I wish I could have heard that when they played out at Trinkle's, out in that old tin building.
You're going to find this hard to believe, but I remember my grandparents taking me to Joe Trinkle's place, and I can see Mrs. Trinkle at that piano yet. You talk about a crude place. The pictures
it was
of
a little crude.
in the book, and the people gathered around there for barn dances.
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing that happened in barn dances is that at a certain time the hay mows were all cleared up, and the individual farmers they would come for miles around, and they would have a barn dance. And what I recall is that I was such a little guy. They had lots of kids running around there, and they had blankets, and they put us back in the corner, and they had their party in the hay mow. Mm-hmm. On the barns.
You also talked about the business of going to town on the night that the stores were open.
Saturday night.
And how exciting that was.
Oh, yeah, that was a big thing.
And I can remember when I lived with my grandparents, they lived in a little town that's not far from Rochester, Minnesota. And it was a small town, and on Friday night, everybody came to town, and they'd just stand around and chat with one another. And you said your mom was very anxious that your dad should get an appropriate parking place so that you could get the best view of who's here, and that was the way it was in Kenyon too.
Yeah. Saturday nights here was it was crowded.
I remember
literally crowded.
It was always a little bit of a struggle between Dad saying, I really got to get finished up in the field, and Mom wanted to get into Lincoln so you could park on the square and see who was in town.
Sure.
And that was a big
talk
thing.
about innocent entertainment. Sit in your car and watch folks go by.
That was it. And see who was in town, and I'm sure there was all kinds of conversation, but I didn't really care about much of that. We would always cross it. That's when we first started to go to Tibbs's High Spot, which was in the Daner building. My dad and Mr. Tibbs got to be friends, and Tommy Tibbs and I were buddies, and we would go down there and go to Daner's. And there was a grocery store Mr. Wackerly had right on the corner, and they'd shop there. Much different time. Everybody knew everybody, and Mom walked in, and they'd say, "Oh, listen, we got this for you." Well, that was also in the days of ration books. So they would put things back, and of course, they'd have the stamp for it. They wouldn't, that I know, Mom always had to pull those stamps out. But that was, it was such a different time. As I said, my dad was, in the winter, would hunt and trap, and would take the furs into Birch's. Bob, Tony Birch's there, and on the curve, and that was something to see all those furs, and they'd get a little money. Sometimes they'd take some coons and skin those, and they'd sell those. Different taverns would buy them, and that money went to Tibbs's High Spot for hamburger and chilies. But that was, to think about going in town and making extra money with furs. Don't think about that.
The unfortunate truth is that not many people really care too much about what our lives were at that time. It's memories we have, but life has become very frenetic today. Lots of pressures from every direction, 360 degrees of pressure on everybody for one reason or another, some valid, some not so valid. But the bottom line is, I think most of the populace out there, they're not that interested in the history of what we experienced.
But one of the strangest things, I figured that when I wrote it, people our age would be the only ones that would read it, my classmates and people like that. And what I've had people come up to me, many of whom I don't know, and that hurts my feelings because living in Lincoln all my life, I feel I should know everyone. And they said, really liked your book and that, and they're like 25 years younger, 30 years younger. It's like, wait a minute, this is not anything about your time.
Well, it maybe proves the old guy.
The 50s, too, though, have been idealized in movies and plays and music. And so maybe that's a time that people kind of are interested in.
Yeah, they've asked, they'll ask, what was it really like? And I think I've been told by many people, young people in different places, said the great advantage you people had was you didn't have to deal with drugs. You didn't have the pressure of drugs, which is
But we
so
did
much
know
more.
there was such a thing, and we knew they had it in New York and probably Chicago. But
certainly in New
there
York.
was nothing like that.
Well, until The Man with the Golden Arm, Frank Sinatra, came out about the trumpet player in New York who was addicted to heroin, it wasn't even thought of that I know of. I didn't know of anybody. And of course, when I taught college later on, you had to spend a good deal of your time dealing with that problem. Wondering if that kid was going to be okay, or whether you were going to have to, whether he was going to fall out of his chair and you were going to have to call the nurse. I mean, altogether different time. And I think they look back at the 50s as at least you didn't have that time yet. I know we have better looking cars than they got today.
That's a fact. Well, we've appreciated your time, Paul. It's as I said, it's kind of fun for us older geezers to do a little reminiscing and think about how things were at the time we were growing up. I always try to find a point or two to close the viewpoint that's relevant to the guest. And here I found one that about authors, and it said, to an author, writing is a pleasure, especially when he doesn't have to do it. So I know you had a lot of pleasure writing this book, and we appreciate your time this morning. We thank Paul Beaver.
Thank you.
Tune in next Wednesday for a Viewpoint at 8:15.